is a fabulous venue, so again, we want to thank our lead sponsors, Raymond and Sachi Moriyama, and Bruce Kurabara. And ask them to come up to accept just a token of our appreciation.
Bruce, okay. And Raymond and Zach. Bruce.
I would say that I'm just very happy to be here, and I have a tremendous amount of gratitude. I think that the whole settlement of redress is actually a kind of universal concept of really being able to move forward and beyond. One of the reasons I became an architect is because I had a role model, and he's right here. He's right here. It's an amazing thing what role models do for you.
What a guy. It's a great evening, and I think we're all very happy about the celebration. And I feel that we owe a lot to a small group of people who struggled for nearly 40 years, thinking about it, talking about it, acting on it. And it was a fight for justice, and I think it was a fight for all Canadians, not just the Canadians of Japanese origin. So, thank you very much for organizing this evening, and thanks to you all.
So now is the time to reflect on leadership and those who made a difference, both past and present. And I hope you will read our booklet. We tried to make up for the lack of an ideal speaking situation by putting a lot into our booklet. So we hope you'll read about Andrew Bruin, who was a voice back in the 40s for Japanese Canadians. And we will ask that John Bruin, his son, come up to accept a token of our appreciation for a family whose legacy of social justice continues. I have your certificate, but I just can't find it right now. I've been pretty busy. I'll give it to you shortly.
Thank you very much.
I'd love to have a picture.
Sure.
Thank you. Okay. When most others were hostile to our community, the Jewish community welcomed us, rented rooms and homes to us, and employed us. So it's with great sorrow that we say that the Toronto NAJC understands that hate knows no borders and condemns all acts of hatred directed at any ethnic or racial minority. We express our deepest sympathy to the families and friends of the victims of the recent hate crimes in Pittsburgh and Louisville in the U.S. And we reflect on the behind-the-scenes contribution of Ben Fiber, a reporter for the Globe and Mail. He died in 2002. 2012. But I hope you will read about him in the booklet, because he secured the first national press coverage for the Redress campaign at a time when the press began to focus on divisions within the community, divisions regarding individual versus group compensation. And also that if you look at the list in the program of the National Coalition of Supporters, there are 12 rabbis. And that support of the Jewish community continues today with Jordan Spangler-Ross, who's led the Amazing Landscapes of Injustice project from day one. He has secured, I think, almost $9 million in funding for all kinds of research into how property was seized and where it went.
Thank you, Mike. Coming up, as you watch Justice Monica Omatsu's video, Swimming Upstream, Justice Revealed, imagine now what it would have been like for the elderly through the upheavals of incarceration and displacement. Founding members of Momiji, Fred Tsunahara and Fred Sasaki, dedicated themselves to the care of the Issei and Nisei early on, and were supporters of redress in their own way. Kazuo Oye, Roy Shinobu, and Roger and Mary Obata were also founding members of Momiji. Roger Obata was also the vice president of the NAJC through the Redress campaign year. It's in recognition of the efforts of the many volunteers and these dedicated leaders that the Greater Toronto chapter of the NAJC wishes to announce a pledge to donate $60,000 to the Momiji Healthcare Society fundraising campaign over the next 3 years, 2019, 2020, and 2021. A presentation of the donation will be made early in the new year. My mom is at Momiji. She's going to be 100 in January. Apparently Momiji has the oldest people in the world in Momiji. Thank you very much. And they take great care at Momiji. I'll be there soon, so I hope I can say. Now on to our speakers. Justice Monica Omatsu is the first Asian Canadian female judge in Canada. She was part, She was part of the NAJC strategy team and provided legal counsel to the NAJC through the redress negotiations. Art Miki, the NAJC president who signed the redress agreement, was awarded an NAJC Lifetime Achievement Award at the NAJC Gala at the Human Rights Museum in September. Both have continued to carry on the legacy of redress in over the past 3 years. 3 decades. Sorry. I'm going to hand it over to Monica.
Good evening. It's such a pleasure to be here. Given how everybody's standing, I asked if I would be allowed to stand on a chair so you could see me. And they said that their insurance does not cover that. So I hope you can hear me. Redress was a campaign that we started in 1980. And the first half of it, to 80 to 88, and the first half of the time was spent getting consensus in our community because the press and the government ignored us because they said your community is split. And that's where I think Toronto or the division was the greatest, really owes a huge round of applause from our community nationally and from Canadians, because it was these people in this room who were able to bring consensus and show that the NAJC represented our community. The last half of that decade was taking the case to the public and making it a Canadian issue so that we were able to be successful. And again, you folks here were largely responsible for that kind of victory, and I thank you very much. Since I'm from Hamilton and also live in Toronto, I'm not going to, you've heard me many times, so I'm not going to make a speech, but instead I'm going to show my first video, which is called Swimming Upstream. And right now, BC is in negotiations with the NAJC, and Art and I are on the negotiating team, not the negotiating team, we're on the advisory committee, sorry. And this video is being shown around the province and in the country to set the case against BC in terms of our community. And frankly, none of us would be here if it wasn't because of that machination of the two governments and the politicians. So I have spoken with the Toronto NAJC reps and suggested that if any of you are interested in what you think the BC government should do, they call it post-apology measures, because they apologized to our community in 2012. Please tell them what you think. We started to show my video in BC and had community meetings. And once kind of consensus, hopefully, we will present it to the BC government. We've had 3 meetings with them so far, once last fall and twice this spring, and met with the Premier as well. And there'll be another meeting later this year. So let's hopefully show the video. Can you dim the lights a bit, please?
In the late 19th century, thousands of Japanese immigrants from a feudal island arrived on these shores to help clear the forest, harvest the seas, and develop the wealth of a young country. What they met was white hostility. In 1895, British Columbia denied Asian people and First Nations people the rights of citizenship. In 1900, Tommy Hama challenged this law. He won in the BC courts, but the province appealed to England's Privy Council and succeeded, preserving its power to deny their vote to Asians and First Nations. Decades of tension and fear of the Yellow Peril erupted when angry whites mobbed Vancouver's Japantown area. Despite the racism, Japanese Canadians continued to thrive in fishing, logging, mining, and farming. They established businesses and raised families. Canada declared war on Japan after the December 7, 1941 bombing of Pearl Harbor. The War Measures Act was invoked and applied to those of Japanese ancestry, as it had been against German and Italian Canadians in 1939. However, by comparison, German and Italian Canadians were largely unaffected. Those with Japanese ancestry were branded as enemy aliens, ordered to carry ID cards, be fingerprinted, and registered. BC wanted more. All levels of BC governments conspired to expel Japanese Canadians and expropriate their property from the protected area 100 miles inland from the coast. Now is the time to address British Columbia's responsibility and leadership role in ethnic cleansing, property dispossession, and community destruction. Some powerful forces spoke against the removal. The Army's Lieutenant Governor Ken Stewart reported, "I cannot see that they constitute the slightest menace to national security." RCMP Assistant Commissioner Frederick Meade agreed, "No fear of sabotage need be expected from the Japanese in Canada." The Prime Minister's Executive Assistant, Jack Pickersgill, confirmed, "I don't think that there was a member of cabinet who honestly believed that the Japanese were dangerous. It was a British Columbia problem." Initially, Ottawa resisted taking more extreme measures. Despite no evidence of a security risk, BC politicians began a concerted campaign to cleanse the province of Japanese Canadians. In January 1942, Premier John Hart appointed Cabinet Minister George Pearson to lead a BC delegation to Ottawa, where they joined forces with Federal Cabinet Minister Ian Mackenzie to demand the uprooting of all, including women and children. Responsible politicians were BC Federal MP Robert Mayhew, along with Ministers Royal Maitland and Harry Perry, CCF leader Harold Winch, and MLA Alan Neal. MP Mackenzie went on public record stating, "It is the government's plan to get these people out of BC as fast as possible. It is my personal intention, as long as I remain in public life, to see they never come back here." In the end, Ottawa conceded to BC's demands. On February 24, 1942, by ordering, all persons of the Japanese race are to leave the protected area. The order was executed quickly. The BC Security Commission, a federal agency, directed the uprooting, dispersal, and incarceration. It involved BC Representative John Shiras and MLAs Maitland, Pearson, and Winch. The camps were often erroneously referred to as internment camps. The Geneva Conventions state a country cannot intern its own nationals, only enemy foreigners. BC refused to pay for children's education, a provincial obligation. The camps relied largely on religious groups and their own resources. More than 2,600 men in 24 labor camps along the Trans-Canada built roads in the interior. The last camp closed in March 1946. To hasten the removal of families from the province, the BC Security Commission advertised these laborers as both industrious and loyal. Resistors to the breakup of families were sent to a POW camp in Ontario. In 1943, George Collins, chair of BC Security Commission, ordered, These people will be dispersed across Canada in small groups and exiled from BC. In contrast, Japanese Americans were allowed to return to their homes and businesses before the end of the war. However, in 1945, Canada, at the urging of BC politicians, forced all Japanese Canadians to choose between moving east of the Rockies or being shipped to Japan. In the end, 13,000 people were sent east and 4,000 were exiled to Japan. The BC government and the City of Vancouver colluded with the custodian of enemy property in the dispossession. Vancouver City Council wanted to redevelop the Powell Street area. The city urged Glenn McPherson, the custodian's Vancouver representative, to sell all Japanese Canadian homes and businesses in that area. McPherson collaborated with the BC's Municipal Affairs Minister, Edward Bridgman, to obtain municipal property assessment records. Then, McPherson met with Vancouver officials to discuss their interest in acquiring properties. In January 1943, despite Ottawa's initial reluctance, Cabinet bowed to BC pressure and granted the custodian of enemy property the right to dispose of everything without Japanese Canadians' consent. BC judges Sidney Smith and David Whiteside approved each forced sale. The proceeds from the sales paid for the incarceration, contrary to the Geneva Conventions. In the US, there was no seizure or sale of property. Gone was Vancouver's Japantown, the geographical heart of the community, where the pulse was felt, where more than 8,000 people lived, worked, and played. 59 language schools in the province were closed. Education was disrupted. Vibrant business communities were wiped out. Future generations lost touch with their heritage, resulting in the loss of language and culture. Prime Minister Mackenzie King declared in 1944, "It is a fact that no person of the Japanese race born in Canada has been charged with any act of sabotage or disloyalty during the years of the war." But post-war BC continued its racist policies. BC reaffirmed the denial of the vote to Japanese Canadians and First Nations in March 1947. In 1948, BC's Premier Brian Johnson prevented Japanese Canadians from returning to the coast. BC agreed to pay half of the cost of their continued exile. In the same year, the province reimposed a 1902 ban that prevented Japanese Canadians from working as loggers on Crown lands. Slowly, the tide changed, and in April 1949, Japanese Canadians won the rights of citizenship through a national political campaign. Almost 40 years later, honor was restored with the signing of the Redress settlement with the federal government. The terms included $21,000 to each survivor, $12 million to a community fund, and $24 million for a race relations foundation.
Thank you very much. The video is on YouTube and on the UK National Museum and the Canadian Race Relations Foundation websites. So it's for public distribution and education. So I hope that you will share it with people. It's my first video, and you'll be happy to know I'm going to take a course in digital filmmaking. So I'll be able to make better videos. Now I'd like to have the opportunity to introduce my friend, Art Needy. I've been told that I can only give a 30-second introduction. So Art was born in Vancouver. He grew up in Manitoba in the sugar beets farms and taught in Winnipeg and as a principal in Winnipeg. And of course, as you know, he was our leader during the important years. He was the leader of the NADC from 84 to 92. And he's the husband of Kate, who was here, and father and grandfather. And Art has won many awards, including the Order of Manitoba, Canada, and the Order of the Rising Sun.
Well, thank you, America. It's a pleasure to be here. This evening was so many people who bring back memories of the time that we had Redress, and I'm so glad that they're all here. It's wonderful to be here this evening to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Redress settlement. And I think it's a great time to reflect on some of the moments that eventually led to a successful campaign. During the Redress campaign, Toronto was a very special place. I visited here on many occasions. We were dealing with the split in the community over compensation, whether it be individual or group, and also which group was a spokesperson for Japanese Canadians. The survivors group with George Mai or Jack Oakey, or the NAJC. I remember the late evening meetings at homes of supporters when I came here to find out what was happening in Toronto and discuss ways to counteract the opposition who was attempting to discredit the NAJC. I remember the raucous meeting we had in 1985 at the United Church when Jack Oakey threatened to resign from the NAJC, of which he was the vice president, and received the thunderous applause. To oppose the Toronto JCCA, the North York chapter of NAJC was formed. West Fujiwara comes to mind, and a number of other people who were helping him to give a supportive voice to the NAJC at a very critical period. They arranged for a grant from the City of Toronto for the Price Waterhouse study, despite opposition from the survivors group. I want to commend the group of people, many of them who are here this evening, and those who have passed away, but their support is not forgotten as they played a major role in helping us achieve redress. I want to acknowledge the members of the strategy committee who are here. Mariko Matsu, Bryce Kambara, and Roger Obata, who suddenly passed away. They were the ears and eyes during a difficult period in the redress campaign. There were attempts by the government, especially Ministers Jack Murda, Otto Jelinek, and even David Crombie, to divide and conquer us using the survivors group to discredit the NAJC. The members of the team remained loyal and focused on important goals, the recognition of individual compensation, when there were people within our own community willing to accept whatever the government was willing to offer. I would like to thank the Nisei, such as Harold Hirose and Roger Abada, who had gone through the Bird Commission ordeals to keep us on track to what meaningful compensation meant. Also, I appreciated the insights of the late Gordon Hirabashi, whose belief was that for redress to be meaningful, individual compensation needed to be the cornerstone of any redress settlement. After meeting unsuccessfully with two previous ministers between 1984 and 86, the NAJC was given an ultimatum by David Crombie, then minister, in 1987, July. And his ultimatum was either you accept the $12 million that the government is offering as a community fund, or we terminate discussions for redress. In the end, we rejected the offer. And I would say the ability to say no was our strength, and not to back down from what we were seeking. Considered to be a just and honorable resolution. Other supporters, such as the Toronto Ad Hoc Committee on JC Redress, took out a national campaign ad in 1942. I think you'll remember this one. In 1942, Canada sent a lot of kids to camp. Unfortunately, those camps are the internment camps. The Strategy Committee of NAJC, frustrated with the lack of progress, decided to refocus our approach and adopt a different strategy. And in a way, we used the ad hoc committee's model. We changed the focus to get broader support from Canadians to make redress a Canadian human rights issue. The Coalition for Japanese Canadian Redress was established in 1987 with Justice Tom Berger of Vancouver as honorary chair. And the NAJC hired David Murata from Toronto to coordinate our plans to get Canadians involved. We managed to get the support of major unions, churches in Canada, ethnic and civil liberty groups, as well as individual Canadians, writers, politicians, professors, mayors of cities, interested people. The NAJC asked individuals and organizations to support what we call a negotiated settlement. What that means is that a settlement that both parties can agree to. In Toronto, the chapter here organized an ethnocultural rally in 1987 where 20 ethnic organizations from Ontario expressed support and signed a letter for the government. These were very important because most could support a resolution to give NAJC and the government support a resolution that they could agree upon. And the same rhetoric applied when we met with our opposition parties. I recall one politician saying to me after one of our meetings that had you asked for us to support individual compensation, our party would not do it. And partly it's because there's a fear that when you're using taxpayers' money, they could be under threat in terms of reactions from the Canadian public. By involving other Canadians, Redress became a Canadian human rights initiative. This culminated in a rally in '84, April 14th, 1988, and we see a lot of signs that were, I guess, saved from that particular rally. I saw them this afternoon. Where the majority of victims of the internment marched on Parliament Hill, followed by the rally inside the West Block to hear many coalition supporters, including David Suzuki. In attendance was Honorable Jerry Weiner, recently appointed Minister of Multiculturalism, who was moved by the show of support, and shortly after we received word from the government through him that they wanted to renew talks. I recall the meeting that we had with Jerry Weiner, and when he said we would like to meet, the first thing I asked him, if you're asking us to support what you had presented before, we're not prepared to meet. And his reaction was, I've talked to the Prime Minister, and he claims that everything is on the table, which meant discussion on individual compensation. And therefore we met, and it was shortly after we had word that the government would like to go through a negotiation process with us. That was August of 1988 in Montreal. And in Montreal, we were told this was a secret meeting. No one was to know that we're meeting. And at that meeting, we came to an agreement that we would have redress. But as we left the meeting, we were instructed not to tell anybody about what had transpired. I remember Roger Obata telling us he couldn't even tell his wife. But 2 weeks ago I found out that he was telling Bill Koashi, who knew about it before his wife. But anyways, the point was that secrecy was there because we were told that the Prime Minister and some of his cabinet ministers had to convince the rest of the cabinet that they would support redress. At this point in time, only 4 politicians knew about this particular agreement. And that was our Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, Honorable Jerry Wiener, and Lucien Bouchard. And it's interesting because Lucien Bouchard played a fairly instrumental role that we don't hear of too often. But remember, he came into the government in April 1988. And in August 1988, we had a resolution. And during that period of time, some other things happened within the government. One of the strongest opponents of redress in the cabinet became ill and had to resign from cabinet. As a result, that gave our Prime Minister an opportunity to move forward, because up to that point, he could not get the support of the entire cabinet. Now that we had the secret agreement, their job of the 4 people was to convince the other people that they support the redress success. We were fortunate to have chance happenings at opportune times for us, eventually to be successful. Call it being in the right place at the right time, or just plain luck. Whatever, there were several occasions where the government attempted to impose a settlement without our approval. And that was thwarted at the last moment. And the time I recall most vividly was in January '85, when the government threatened to impose a settlement. And the way they were going to do it is they had met with a group in Toronto at that time, and they were meeting with the NAJC, and the argument they were going to use is that we've already consulted the community, and they wanted to put through a motion. Well, we heard about the possibility of this happening, so we went to Ottawa, and we met with all the opposition leaders. John Turner was the Liberals, and Ed Broadbent was the NDP party. And we were sitting in Brad Broadbent's office when his House leader came in to the room, and he indicated to Ed Broadbent that the government was planning to present the bill tomorrow morning. This is in the afternoon. And he wanted the NDP support. And the first thing that Ed Broadbent said to me, he looked at me and said, "Did anyone talk to you about this?" I said, "No, we've had no discussion on this at all." And he finally told the House leader that the NDP would not support any motion that would be brought forward. And so that motion never came forward. But I often think about that particular day, because had we not been there, would it have been possible for them to have passed that motion? Because the argument they were going to use is that they had consulted with the community. One group that needs to receive recognition is the media. It was their stories, documentaries, radio talk shows I was on many times, ongoing interviews, all contributed to Canadians learning about the experience of the Japanese prior to, during, and after the Second World War. The editorial boards were very supportive of NAJC's position. And when we put out the Price Water Study report, the editorial boards were quick to support the NAJC for some form of compensation. We could not have paid for that kind of publicity and support that we had from the media. It's interesting, the media is always interested in knowing what's happening. And every time we had a meeting in Ottawa, I would certainly get requests for an interview by some reporters. And I recall this one time when we were in Ottawa, we had finished the meeting, and I had a phone call from a CBC reporter saying, "We would like to interview you. Can we do it first thing tomorrow morning?" Because I was going to leave Sunday, and it was Sunday morning. So she came down to do the interview, and that was fine. And the lobby of the hotel was really noisy. something like what it was here earlier in the morning, in the evening. But anyways, it was very noisy, and she said, this is not a very good place to have an interview. And I said, I happened to put my hand in, although I had checked out, I had my room card, and I said, well, I had a room here, maybe we could go up there. So we went up to the room, and I opened the door, and lo and behold, there's a woman there who was folding the beds in. And she looked at me, and I said to her, I have to use this room. And she looked at behind me, there's a woman standing there. And so she looked at me with a shock. I said, you know what, I'll make it quick. At that point, her face dropped, and I realized what the implications were that she was thinking. And so I said, oh, hold it. This lady's a reporter from CBC, and she had a tape recorder, and she held up her tape recorder. And this woman laughed and shook her head and said, fine, go ahead. In the course of our Redress campaign, we came in contact with a number of politicians who gave us hope, strength, and encouragement. People like Ed Broadbent, John Fraser, the Speaker of the House, played a very important role, although he was not supposed to be political, but he did behind-the-scenes talking for us. Ernie Epp, Sergio Markey, David Kilgore, Ellen Redway from Toronto, and Dan Heath come to mind. Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, I truly believe, I truly believe was serious in its efforts to redress Japanese Canadians. And I say this very humbly. I recall the day that we signed the agreement on September 22nd. I met with the Prime Minister before we went down to the signing area in his private office. It was just he and I alone. And I recall remembering commenting him that it's taken us so long to get to where we are, to realize our dream. And he in turn replied to me, he says, it has taken me this long to convince my cabinet that this was the right thing to do. And I think his words certainly were humbling, and when we went down and signed the agreement, he certainly reflected that kind of attitude. I know that there was a lot of, as I mentioned before, opposition in his cabinet, and those were overcome. And so I guess in a way we were very fortunate, the timing was right for us. And by that time the American bill had been signed, so there were a number of factors that helped us. Well, I want to conclude by saying that we're glad that 30 years later we are able to still tell our story. I just remember a few weeks ago we had a representative from the Chinese community speaking at our conference in Winnipeg, and she made one comment that stuck with me. She said, the government gave us an apology for the head tax, but she said, today no one even talks about it. It's all forgotten, in a sense. And she felt that it was a sorry statement. Here we are 30 years celebrating an agreement that affected a different Aztec community. I say this agreement was very important, and at the time it was signed, the minister who was there said to the press, this is not a precedent, this is a unique event, it's not a precedent, but all the people who were around them were saying, I think it'll be a precedent, and it was. Because later on, there were the Chinese Canadians received the apology for head tax, the Ukrainian Canadians did, the Indian residential school survivors, their program was based on the NAJC model, and I met with them a number of times to discuss strategy, and also the Aboriginal veterans. I met with them several times as well about pursuing their redress campaign. As was mentioned, I was a school teacher and principal at the time, and so I'd be taken away quite a bit, and students sort of knew I was involved in something, because one day a kindergarten student came running up to me as I came and got out of my car going into the school, He came running up to me. He said, Mr. Mickey, I saw you on TV last night. He says, you're a great actor. Well, maybe we were acting. I want to thank Lynn Kobayashi and for inviting Pedro and I to this event. It's a marvelous event. It's a wonderful feeling to get together with some of the, I don't want to say old faces because that would be, from mature faces. People that we knew a while back during an important time. To all the Toronto executive, Bruce, and your executive, and all the volunteers and supporters who helped make this evening a success. And certainly I was really impressed with your souvenir booklet. A lot of very important information. Congratulations to the people who put that together. So, and I'd like to acknowledge that within our audience we have someone from Winnipeg, Robert Falcon-Lett. Are you here? I'm back here. Oh, you're back there. Robert's a member of Parliament from Winnipeg, and I'm glad that he's taking part in the celebrations tonight. It's good to see you, Robert. Arigato miigwech.
Thank you, Art.